My name's Eric Collins, and I was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. I've lived here my whole life. Quiet streets, familiar faces, the kind of place where everyone knows your last name before they even know your first. Out here, family ties mean something. Or at least, they're supposed to. I grew up side by side with my cousin, Mark. We weren't just relatives, we were like brothers. Holidays, birthdays, summers spent fishing at Gray's Lake or tossing a football in my uncle's backyard. He was always there. We shared everything, dreams, secrets, even trouble when we got into it as kids. For most of my life, if you had asked me who I trusted outside of my parents, I would have said Mark without hesitation. But trust has a way of blinding you. You don't see the cracks forming until the whole thing comes crashing down. My father used to tell me, Eric, family will stand by you when no one else will. I believed that. I built my life on that. And then one day, Mark proved just how wrong my father could be. It started small for me to notice at first. Mark was always ambitious, always talking about money, business deals, and how he'd never settle for ordinary. I respected that drive, but as time went on, I realized his ambition had turned into something darker. Greed. When my parents passed, they left behind a modest estate. Nothing extravagant, just the family home, a few acres of land, and some savings they had worked their whole lives to put away. To me, it wasn't about the money. It was about legacy, about holding on to what they had built with their hands and sacrifice. Mark saw it differently. He started dropping hints, little comments like, Eric, it'd be smarter to sell the house and invest that money. Land doesn't mean much these days. Or, why hang on to old things when you can build something new? At first, I thought he was just offering advice. But then he began involving himself in ways he had no right to, talking to lawyers, asking about bank details, even showing up at the county records office without telling me. I brushed it off, telling myself he was just trying to help. After all, this was Mark, my cousin, my closest friend growing up. Surely, he wouldn't try to take what wasn't his. But deep down, a knot was starting to form in my gut. And it wouldn't take long before I learned the truth. Mark wasn't just curious, he was plotting. The wedding day arrived, and the town buzzed with whispers. People dressed in their finest clothes, gathering in the old church where Emily and Jacob were to be wed. My mother sat in the front row, a proud smile etched on her face. But beneath that smile, I could see her eyes flicker, nervous, almost guilty. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to steady myself as the bells tolled. Emily walked down the aisle, radiant in her gown. Her eyes were on Jacob, but every so often, I caught her glance at me, quick and fleeting, like a secret she was trying to bury. Jacob stood tall, confident, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the polished surface of the ceremony. To everyone else, it was a perfect day. But to me it felt like watching a play where every actor was lying. When the vows were spoken, I felt a chill run through me. Emily's voice trembled as she said "I do," while Jacob smiled proudly. Oblivious, I clenched my fists. This wasn't love, it was betrayal dressed in white lace and roses. Every cheer, every clap from the crowd felt like another stab in my chest. My sister was gone, my best friend was gone, and I was left standing in their shadows, pretending to celebrate while they tore me apart. I kept quiet that day. I smiled when people looked my way, but deep inside, a fire was lit. That fire would only grow, waiting for the moment when I could finally take back what they stole from me. The days after the wedding were some of the darkest I'd ever known. My house felt colder, emptier. The silence weighed on me heavier than chains. I'd pass by Emily and Jacob's new home just across the town square, and I'd see them laughing on the porch, sharing dinners, living the life I once thought I'd have a part in. At night, I couldn't sleep. Their voices would haunt me, not in whispers, but in echoes. Emily's promise that she'd always protect me, Jacob's vow that he'd never leave me behind, both shattered, lying in pieces at my feet. I tried to convince myself to move on, to bury the anger, but every smile they shared was another reminder of what they'd stolen. Then one evening, I saw Jacob walking out of the tavern, his arm draped around another woman. He was laughing, careless, his eyes glassy with drink, and suddenly, I realized Emily had betrayed me for a man who couldn't even honor her. My fury doubled. My sister had ruined our bond, destroyed my trust, for someone who wasn't even worthy of her loyalty. That night, I made a decision. No more sitting quietly in the background. No more suffering in silence. If they thought they could build happiness on my broken heart, I'd make sure they'd never know peace again. My revenge wasn't just an idea anymore, it became a plan. Revenge rarely blooms from yelling. It grows in quiet rooms, in late-night phone calls, in the steady stacking of paper, until the pile becomes undeniable. That's where I started. I made a list, every scrap of paper that might prove what my parents had intended. Insurance receipts, property tax bills, old letters my mom wrote and tucked into drawers, the canceled checks I'd pulled out of a shoebox years ago and forgotten about. I drove to the Polk County Recorder's office on a gray Tuesday, the kind of day Des Moines wears like a coat you can't shrug off. The clerk behind the counter recognized me. He'd watched me grow up and didn't question why I was there. People who live in one place a long time don't pry. They notice. At the Recorder's office, I learned how the system could be used by men with smooth tongues. Mark had been careful too careful. Transfers filed under LLCs with generic names, signatures that at first glance looked right, and notarizations from people who'd since moved away. But there were gaps, a missing page here, a dated stamp that didn't match the rest, an odd delay between when a document was signed and when it was recorded. Those were the threads you pull until a sweater comes undone. I also started talking, but only to people I trusted. Not shouting from the roof. A neighbor who'd known my dad since before I was born told me things offhandedly about a late-night visit Mark had made to our house a few months after the funeral, about how he'd dropped off papers and left before sunrise. An aunt I rarely visited admitted she'd been pressured into signing something at Mark's insistence. Small things, by themselves, but together they began to form a picture. Money-wise, I wasn't rich. I didn't hire a fancy firm. Instead, I found someone practical, a local paralegal named Jenna who did honest work for folks who couldn't afford to be fleeced. We met at the library, between the stacks and the humming computers, and I laid my binders on the table like cards in a poker game. Jenna didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She listened, then said exactly what I needed to hear. We freeze transfers. We subpoena records. We make it messy for him. That was all I wanted. Messy. We filed a motion to put a hold on any real estate transactions. It was a small paper act but powerful. It stopped Mark from flipping the property or moving assets while we dug deeper. Then we requested bank records tied to those LLCs and served subpoenas. The legal language felt sterile, but the result wasn't. Suddenly, Mark couldn't move in the shadows. While Jenna worked the papers, I worked the softer side of things. I started keeping careful notes, dates, times, a running journal of who said what and when. I photographed faded deeds in the attic, annotated margins with memory prompts, and recorded names of men who'd been at the house the day my parents signed the will. I didn't post anything online. I didn't vent to anyone who might turn a head. This was tight, focused work. Evidence first, noise later, and the town began to notice. in the way only small places do. People who'd once smiled at Mark now paused when we crossed paths. Simple courtesies cool for a man who built a reputation on charm and being everywhere. That cooling was dangerous. It didn't look like much to outsiders, it was just ordinary life, but to me, it was the air changing before a storm. I slept less and moved with purpose. The slow work of gathering truth felt heavy and right. I knew then that when the time came to act, it wouldn't be a single blow. It would be a professional, relentless series of steps that left no room for his smooth talk. And that is the kind of thing that breaks men who built empires on smiles. It's funny how numbers can betray a man faster than words ever will. People can lie with their mouths, but bank records don't know how to bend the truth. When Jenna and I finally got the first batch of documents back, it felt like I'd been handed the skeleton key to my uncle's locked chest. The records showed transfers small at first, then larger, bleeding out of the trust account my parents had set up. Money that should have gone toward upkeep of the farm, toward property taxes, toward repairs. Instead, it was funneling into an LLC Mark controlled. From there, it branched out. A new truck, home renovations, payments to contractors for jobs that never lined up with reality. He'd hidden it well, disguised under business names. But the trail was there. We highlighted each line in neon yellow until the pages glowed like warning signs. One name kept popping up, a shell construction company based 2 counties over. No website, no office, no real employees. Just a poll box and a bank account that Mark seemed awfully fond of. It didn't take long to realize it was a ghost company, a laundry chute for stolen inheritance. That's when it hit me. He hadn't just taken land. He'd been draining the lifeblood my parents left behind. Years of work, sweat, and sacrifice boiled down to account numbers that he thought no one would ever notice. I felt anger, sure, but beneath it, something sharper, a strange kind of calm. Because once you catch a man's pattern, you own him. Mark's arrogance had been his mistake. He believed no one in our family had the grit or the patience to put the pieces together. He thought grief had blinded us for good, but grief, when it settles, turns into something else, clarity. I saw that now. Jenna drafted another filing, this time more aggressive. We pushed for an injunction on Mark's LLC accounts, arguing they were directly tied to the estate. If granted, it would freeze his access to the very money he'd been living on. She told me it was a long shot. Judges don't hand those out easy, but the evidence was strong enough to take the gamble. Meanwhile, I kept my head down in town. Mark was still shaking hands, still grinning at diners like he owned every booth. But I noticed the cracks. His laugh had a twitch to it now. He avoided eye contact longer. One night at the gas station, I caught him staring at me across the pumps, the nozzle dangling in his hand, expression tight like he was chewing something bitter. That was the first time I knew he felt the shift. The control he thought he had was slipping, inch by inch. I didn't gloat. Not then, because revenge isn't loud in its middle stages. It's quiet, methodical, the steady tightening of a rope. And I was still pulling. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. I'd been in that room before. Traffic tickets, jury duty, but this time was different. This time, every word spoken had the weight of my family's legacy behind it. Mark strutted in like he owned the place, tailored suit, expensive watch glinting under the lights. He flashed that politician's smile of his, shaking hands with people he barely knew. To anyone watching, he looked untouchable, the golden son of the Collins family. But I wasn't fooled. I had the receipts. Jenna sat beside me, calm as stone, her folder thick with highlighted documents. She whispered, "Let him talk. He'll hang himself." And she was right. When the judge asked him to explain the transfers, Mark leaned back in his chair and spun a tale about business reinvestments and strategic diversification. He talked fast, smooth, confident. If I didn't know the truth, even I might have believed him. But then Jenna stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply walked the judge through the paper trail, every dollar, every fake invoice, every show company. One by one, the lies unraveled. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of the judge's pen. Mark's face changed then. His smile slipped, his jaw tightened, and he couldn't meet my eyes. For the first time, the mask cracked. He wasn't the untouchable cousin anymore. He was just a man caught red-handed. The judge didn't make a final ruling that day, but he granted the injunction. Effective immediately, Mark's accounts were frozen. No more trucks, no more renovations, no more bleeding my parents' legacy dry. As we walked out, Jenna leaned in and said, "This is just the beginning." And for the first time since the betrayal, I felt it momentum shifting in my favor. The rope around Mark's neck was tightening, and I was the one pulling the knot. The courthouse steps were crowded that afternoon, reporters buzzing around a bigger case, lawyers rushing past, families arguing in hushed tones. I was halfway to my truck when I heard the voice I'd grown up with only. Now it carried venom. "You think you've won something." Mark's words cut through the noise. I turned, and there he was, pacing fast toward me, his suit jacket half open, eyes burning. The polished cousin everyone loved at Sunday dinners was gone. What stood there now was raw anger wrapped in desperation. "You froze my accounts," he hissed, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Do you even know what you started, Eric? You think you're some kind of hero." His finger jabbed the air like he wanted to stab me with it. "You're nothing. Always were." I didn't answer right away. The old me, the one who grew up tossing footballs with him in Uncle Joe's yard, might have tried to calm him down to find reason. But that version of me was buried the day he forged our future into his pocket. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said quietly, "You're scared, and you should be." That stopped him, just for a second, but enough. His jaw clenched, his fists balled. But he didn't swing. He wanted to. God, I saw it in every twitch of his body. But he knew one more misstep, one outburst in front of witnesses, and the judge's patience with him would vanish. So he leaned closer, his voice dropping low. "This isn't over. You think you can take me down with some papers and a smile. You don't know what I'm capable of." I didn't flinch. "No," I said, "I don't think I know." For a long moment, we just stood there, two grown men with decades of family history simmering between us. Then he spat on the ground at my feet, turned, and stormed off into the crowd. Watching his back disappear, I realized something. He was unraveling. The calm, collected mask he'd worn all his life was gone. And desperate men, they make mistakes. Mistakes I could use. It didn't take long for Mark to try his next play. Within a week, the phone calls started. First, it was Aunt Linda, her voice shaking, as she asked me why I was dragging family through the mud. Then Uncle Joe, gruff and bitter, accusing me of letting outsiders poke around in private business. Word was spreading fast. Mark had gone on a charm offensive, spinning the narrative that I was the greedy one, that I was the ungrateful nephew trying to tear the family apart for money. At Sunday service, I could feel eyes on me. Whispers floated through the pews, subtle but sharp. The Collins family had always been respected in town, but now I was the one with a target on my back. Mark was using the very thing I valued most, our family name, like a weapon against me. At first, it stunned. These were people who'd watched me grow up, who'd hugged me at graduations, who'd shared Christmas dinners with me. Now some of them wouldn't even meet my gaze. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't strength on Mark's part. It was desperation. He couldn't fight the evidence, so he was trying to win the war of perception. Jenna reminded me of something important. Reputation is loud, Eric, but evidence is louder. So I doubled down. I started keeping records of every call, every text, every piece of slander he spread. I spoke only when necessary, never letting anger push me into mistakes. Let him talk. Let him smear my name because, when the truth came out, it would sting him twice as hard. One night, I sat alone on the porch, staring at the old oak tree in the yard my father had planted. I thought about how Mark and I used to climb it, daring each other to go higher, scraping our knees and laughing till sunset. Now, here we were, two grown men circling each other like enemies, with that same tree still standing between us. I made myself a promise that night. I wasn't just going to expose Mark. I was going to strip him of the very thing he worshipped most, his image. He'd played the town like fools for years. Soon enough, they'd see the truth, and when they did, there'd be no coming back for him. Desperation has a smell to it like smoke before a fire, and with Mark, I could smell it from miles away. The frozen accounts had crippled him more than he let on. His truck payments fell behind. Contractors stopped answering his calls, and the local bank started sniffing around his LLC. That's when the shady moves began. Late-night visits to people no Collins should have been seen with. Guys who did their business in the back of pawn shops and greasy diners. I didn't have proof at first, just whispers. But the whispers turned into sightings. A buddy from high school, now working as a security guard downtown, called me one night. Eric, you might want to know your cousin was just spotted handing envelopes to a guy who's been under federal watch. I wasn't surprised. Mark had always loved gambling with other people's trust, and now that his empire was collapsing, he was looking for shortcuts to keep himself afloat. The irony was thick. He'd stolen from family to build his house of cards, and now he was dealing with men who'd burned that house down for pocket change. I passed the tip to Janet. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk, and said, "If he's moving money off the books now, it won't just be civil court we're dealing with. This could cross into criminal." The thought sent a strange shiver down my spine. I had started this journey thinking it was about reclaiming what was mine, what my parents had left, but now it was bigger. This was about stopping a man who was willing to burn down the Collins name, our family's reputation, just to keep himself standing. Mark thought he was untouchable, but every reckless choice tightened the net, and as much as part of me still hated the idea of dragging family into handcuffs, I realized something cold and clear. If he kept going down this path, prison wouldn't just be justice, it would be mercy. It started small. An unfamiliar SUV parked across from my cousin's office building, then another one a few blocks away near his house. The kind of vehicles that looked ordinary to most people, but not to me. Too clean, windows too dark. They sat there for hours, engines off, not moving an inch. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, but then one evening, while leaving Jenna's office, I caught a glimpse of a man with a camera lens as long as my forearm, snapping shots of Mark walking out of a steakhouse. It wasn't the local press. These were federal eyes. Jenna confirmed it the next day. "The IRS is circling," she said, sliding a letter across her desk. "Someone tipped them off about undeclared income tied to Mark's shell companies. Once they dig in, they'll follow every dollar until the trail ends." I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because justice was finally coming from more than just me. Unease because Mark was cornered, and cornered men don't go down quietly. And sure enough, his mask cracked even further. At the next family gathering, a half-hearted attempt at my aunt's birthday, he exploded. In front of cousins, uncles, nieces, he stood up red-faced and shaking, pointing across the table at me. "This is all his doing. He's poisoning this family. He won't stop until I'm ruined." The room went dead silent. Forks paused midair. Even Aunt Linda, who'd been his loudest supporter, stared at him like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because for the first time, the family saw him for what he was: not a victim, not a golden boy, but a man unraveling. Later that night, sitting in my truck, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance anymore. I was fighting to reclaim my family's name from the grip of a man who thought he owned it. And bit by bit, the town, the law, even blood relatives were starting to see the truth. The knock finally came, not at my door, at Mark's. Word spread fast in a town like Des Moines. By noon, everyone at the diner was talking about the two men in suits who showed up at Mark's front porch, flashing badges. Neighbors saw them walk in with folders and walk out with boxes, laptops, files, even his wife's desktop computer loaded into the back of a government vehicle. I didn't need to be there to picture it. Mark standing in his doorway, sweat on his collar, trying to paste on that confident smile while agents moved past him like he didn't exist. No amount of charm could undo the weight of a federal investigation. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was Jenna. "They've opened a case file. Mail fraud, tax evasion, wire transfers across state lines. This isn't just civil anymore, Eric. Your cousin's in real trouble." I leaned back in my chair, the old floorboards creaking under me. For months I'd been the one digging, chasing paper trails, connecting dots. Now the machine was moving on its own. And Mark, he was cutting gears he couldn't stop. But instead of relief, I felt something heavier, a strange sadness, almost grief. This was my cousin, the boy I had grown up with, the one I used to share comic books and fishing poles with, the same kid who once swore he'd never let anything come between us. Now, here we were, me on one side of the law, him on the other. Family divided not by distance or misunderstanding, but by choice, his choice. And yet, beneath that sadness, a harder truth pulsed steady in my chest. He had brought this on himself. All I had done was shine a light. The shadows were his doing. Desperation makes men bold, and Mark was no exception. A week after the raid, he showed up at my doorstep unannounced. It was late, close to midnight, and the sound of his fist pounding on the door rattled through the whole house. When I opened it, there he stood, no suit, no polished smile, just a man in sweatpants and a hoodie, eyes bloodshot, jaw twitching. He looked less like the cousin I'd grown up with and more like a stranger teetering on the edge. "You think this is funny?" he snarled, stepping forward until we were nose to nose. "You think you've won?" I didn't move. I just stared at him, calm, steady. "I didn't do this to you, Mark. You did this to yourself." His laugh was hollow, bitter. "Don't you dare play saint with me. You always wanted what I had. The house, the respect, the family's trust. Well, congratulations, Eric, you've poisoned everyone against me. You happy now?" For a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, not hatred, but fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. It hit me then. This wasn't a man defending his pride. This was a man watching the walls close in and realizing there was no way out. "You could stop this," he whispered, voice cracking. "One word to the investigators, one life for me, and it all goes away. We can fix this, keep it in the family." I shook my head slowly. "You broke the family, Mark. You don't get to play that card anymore." His face twisted, part fury, part desperation. For a second, I thought he might swing at me, but instead, he spat on the porch, the same way he had on the courthouse steps, and stormed off into the night. I stood there long after his car disappeared down the road. The autumn air biting cold. My hands were steady, but my chest ached, because I knew that was it, the final crack. He wasn't going to beg again. The next move he made would be reckless. dangerous, and it would destroy him completely. The reckless move came sooner than anyone expected. 2 days after that midnight visit, I got a call from Jenna. Her voice was tight, clipped. "Eric, you need to sit down for this." Mark had tried to move money again. Despite his accounts being frozen, he'd pulled strings through that ghost construction company, wiring funds across state lines to a partner in Kansas. What he didn't realize was that the feds were already watching every keystroke, every transfer. The moment he hit send, alarms went off. By evening, investigators had him cornered. A warrant was issued, and plainclothes agents picked him up outside a gas station on the edge of town. No cuffs in front of the crowd, quiet, controlled, but the message was clear. He wasn't walking free this time. When the news broke, it hit the family like a thunderclap. Aunt Linda wept in the church parking lot, clutching her Bible as if it could explain away her son's sins. Uncle Joe, red-faced and silent, couldn't even look me in the eye. For years they'd defended him, called me the troublemaker, the greedy nephew. Now they saw the truth carved in black and white on court documents. That night, I sat alone on my porch, listening to the crickets, the faint hum of the highway. I thought about Mark sitting in a holding cell somewhere, his expensive watch stripped off, his suit traded for county orange. And I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was heavier, something that settled deep in my chest. Closure. He had chosen this path, and it had swallowed him whole. But I also felt something else: resolve. Because this wasn't just about Mark anymore. This was about the Collins name, about restoring what my parents had built. His downfall wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of mine. I thought my plan would shake her, maybe even make her regret everything. But no. Instead, she doubled down on her arrogance. She bragged louder, flaunted harder, and started looking at me like I was some pathetic insect crawling at her feet. That's when I realized she wasn't just a mistake in my life. She was my ultimate test. The test of how much pain a man can take before snapping. And trust me, I was close. Real close. There's this moment that sticks with me. She looked me dead in the eyes one night and said, "You'll never be anything without me. You'll always be the boring nobody I left behind." That line hit me harder than any punch ever could. But instead of breaking me, it lit a fire inside me I didn't know I had. Every insult she threw became fuel. Every smirk she flashed became a reason. Every time she tried to bury me, she was actually sharpening the blade I'd one day use to cut her lies apart. Because, while she thought she was dancing on my grave, I was quietly building an empire right underneath her feet. So I stopped reacting. I stopped arguing. Stopped trying to prove myself. Stopped begging for any shred of respect. On the surface, I played the role she wanted: quiet, defeated, harmless. Let her believe she'd broken me. Let her laugh while she thought she'd won. But behind that mask, I was moving in silence. I started building connections she didn't even know existed. Late nights weren't spent sulking, they were spent studying, learning, working, turning every ounce of pain into strategy. My mind became sharper, my vision clearer, my will unshakable. She had her crowd, her spotlight, her shallow victories. I had something stronger: patience. The kind of patience that makes revenge taste like honey when the moment finally comes. And while she was out parading her new life, I was laying bricks on the foundation of mine, one day at a time, one move at a time, preparing for the moment I wouldn't just rise. I'd tower over everything she thought I could never be. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't a loud strike. It's the quiet storm nobody sees coming until it wipes everything clean. It started small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. I picked up extra shifts, saved every dollar, and taught myself skills that most people would never bother learning. I treated every setback like a lesson and every insult like fuel, and little by little, things began to change. The guy everyone thought was done for was suddenly in better shape, sharper with his words, more confident in his walk. People noticed even if they didn't say it out loud, and that silence, that was sweeter than any applause. I started networking with people outside of her circle, people with real vision, people who knew what it meant to build something from the ground up. They saw in me what she tried to bury: drive, resilience, and fire. Money started coming in, not stacks at first, but steady, consistent, enough to prove that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was advancing, and every time I walked past her with my head held high, I could see the confusion in her eyes. She couldn't understand how the man she'd written off was still standing, still growing, still climbing. That's when I realized my revenge wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about proving myself right. And trust me, I wasn't anywhere near finished. I never had to lift a finger to see her world unravel. It was like watching a carefully built tower of cards collapse. With the faintest breath, first came the whispers. People in town started asking questions she couldn't answer. Where the money had gone, why certain debts hadn't been paid. Then came the angry calls. The very investors she had sweet-talked into backing her schemes were now pounding on her door, demanding what was theirs. But the real crack appeared the day the bank stepped in. Turns out, she hadn't been paying her loans on time. She thought she could juggle everything, thought she was smarter than the system. But paper lies only last so long. When they froze her accounts, I heard about it before she did. And let me tell you, hearing the panic in her voice when she realized she couldn't even write a check to cover her own bills, that was a sound I'll never forget. I'd walk through town and see her putting on that fake smile, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was painted across her face. Her shine was gone. Her clothes weren't new anymore. The sparkle in her eyes gone too. She was cornered, and she knew it. And all I had to do was sit back, watch, and wait. It wasn't long before the mask completely slipped. The first public crack came at Sunday service. Our church is small, everyone knows everyone. Margaret had always loved strutting in late, dressed like she was walking a red carpet, shaking hands as if she were some queen. But that morning, she walked in pale, no jewelry, clothes she'd clearly worn before. People noticed. Whispers filled the pews. Then came the real blow. One of the local business owners, an older man she'd conned into lending her money, stood up during fellowship and called her out right there in front of everyone. He demanded to know when she'd repay, and her face turned crimson, her hands trembled. She tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. The whole room knew something was wrong. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once kissed her hand now shut their doors when she walked by. The same people she looked down on, folks she called small-minded, were now gossiping openly about her. The shame clung to her like a shadow she couldn't escape. And me, I didn't have to say a word. I just stood there, shaking hands, sipping coffee, as if I wasn't the one pulling the strings. Inside, though, I felt that cold satisfaction. Justice wasn't loud, it was slow, quiet, and devastating. If public humiliation had shaken her, the storm that followed inside her own walls nearly broke her. Her husband, who had always been her silent supporter, finally snapped. I heard through the grapevine that he confronted her one night, demanding to know why creditors were calling their house at all hours. She tried to spin it, of course, swearing it was just temporary cash flow issues. But the man wasn't stupid. He'd seen the notices, the frozen accounts, the mounting debts. He knew the truth. Their marriage began to unravel. Neighbors could hear the shouting through the open windows, accusations, slamming doors, her voice cracking with desperation. Within weeks, He'd packed a bag and moved out, taking the kids with him. She was left alone in that big, hollow house she'd once paraded like a trophy. That was when she started avoiding people altogether. No more church appearances. No more loud shopping trips or gossip sessions. She pulled her curtains tight, as if hiding from the very world she once craved attention from. And me, I watched all of it unfold with a steady calm. I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. This was the harvest of seeds she had planted herself. I only gave them water. It didn't take long for rock bottom to show its face. The debt collectors who once sent polite letters now came in person, knocking at her door with voices hard and cold. Neighbors saw it, to the sight of Margaret, once the proudful socialite, arguing with men in cheap suits on her front porch. They didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Shame has a way of traveling faster than sound. Then came the foreclosure notice. A bright orange paper slapped right onto her front door for everyone to see. That house, the one she used to flaunt, the one she made us all feel small about, was no longer hers. She tried to fight it, tried to plead with the bank. But numbers don't lie, and signatures don't vanish. By this point, her so-called friends were gone. The people she had entertained at dinner parties. The ones who laughed at her jokes and raised glasses in her kitchen. They didn't answer her calls anymore. She was toxic. A sinking ship nobody wanted to be tied to. One evening, I saw her at the grocery store. No makeup, hair unkempt, clutching a handful of coupons like they were lifelines. Our eyes met for a moment. She looked at me not with anger, not even with hatred, but with something far worse, defeat, pure hollow defeat. And that was when I knew my uncle's wife, the woman who had once cheated me out of what was rightfully mine, had finally paid her debt in full. Sitting on the porch that night, I let the quiet sink in. The town was calm, the autumn air crisp, and for the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Everything that had been stolen from me respect, peace of mind, even part of my own family's trust, was slowly coming back, not with noise or violence, but with patience, strategy, and perseverance. I thought about the lessons learned, that betrayal cuts deep, that people you trust can disappoint in ways you never imagined, and that revenge isn't about anger, it's about justice. It's about reclaiming what's yours while letting the consequences of others' choices fall exactly where they should. Margaret's world had crumbled. My cousin had faced the law, lost his arrogance, and been stripped of the illusions he'd built. And me, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was stronger, wiser, and fully aware of my own worth. Sometimes, life gives you the chance to rewrite the story that once seemed written against you. And when the chance comes, you don't just take it, you own it. Because in the end, it's not about revenge alone. It's about rising above, standing tall, and letting the truth do the rest.